Good. Welcome, everyone. Undoubtedly, our guest from Australia, Shahar, is wondering why we said this talk started at 4 and it's now 4:13.
German reputation already.
Academic time in Germany. It's a big topic. Wonderful. My name is Sarah Eaton. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the co-founder of the Berlin Contemporary China Studies Network. And this is our first joint venture between the BCCN and the D-Link-Relink group, a research consortium co-led by my colleagues at Humboldt University, Claudia Derichts and Andreas Eckert. Claudia had hoped to join us today. Unfortunately, she's under the weather, but I gather she's joining us per Zoom somehow. The D-Link project is really quite centrally engaged with the BRI, which we'll be hearing a lot about today. And so we are joining forces in a series of upcoming talks on various aspects of the BRI, called the Silk Road Talks. So with some shameless BCCN promotion, I'll just tell you quickly about what's coming after our initial launch talk today, which is very exciting. This Friday, this opportunity came up in just the last few days, and it's very exciting. Sean Xie is joining us, and he'll be talking about global civil society and China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is in the morning on Friday, and this will be a Zoom event. And he's a real expert on developments related to civil society in BRI-invested countries. My colleague, Dr. Daniel Fuchs, behind the camera today organized that, so this promises to be really great. So that's taking place in just a few days. And we have another sort of successor talk to Professor Hameiri's talk today, coming up on Monday, the 21st of November, another Silk Road talk. And this is Professor Saori Pitada from the University of Southern California. And she'll be talking about the difference between so-called big push quantity and bankability quality in the geoeconomics of infrastructure financing in the Indo-Pacific. So this is very much in conversation with what Professor Hameiri will be talking with us about today. So, but today we have the exciting first act in our joint venture between D-Link, Relink, and the BCCN, and it's truly a deep honor and a great pleasure to welcome Professor Shahar Hameiri. Professor Hameiri is a professor of international politics at the University of Queensland, and he has really diverse research interests traversing the fields of security, development and aid, governance, political geography, and international relations. And I think that's actually quite a humble description of his research interests. The way I see him is as someone who manages the very difficult job of doing research truly at the intersection of Chinese domestic politics and international relations literature. A lot of his recent work has been in that direction, and that's something that very few of us scholars manage to do, to bridge this divide. He's extremely prolific, has a very intimidating CV, I can tell you that. Published numerous articles as well as books in the recent years. His most recent book, which is sitting on this chair here, thank you, is co-authored with Lee Jones, Fractured China, How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise, published with Cambridge in 2021. And this is a really, really important intervention in the IR debate about China as a rising power. The authors show that sort of dominant international relations assumptions about China as a so-called Westphalian state capable of formulating and carrying out grand strategy really ignores the significance of processes of state transformation in the PRC that have fragmented, decentralized, and internationalized the party-state apparatus. Today, Professor Hameiri will be talking about something, we'll be sharing the results of his recent project called Why the West's Alternative to China's International Infrastructure is Failing. And the format of the next few minutes we'll be together is he'll do a presentation, and then we'll leave lots of time for Q&A. So if you could, please join me in welcoming Professor Hameiri.
Thank you for your extremely generous introduction. Yeah, I mean, what you're going to be seeing today is actually, as I was saying to some people here before we started, the wreckage of a project that was meant to look one way, but ended up looking very different. So cast your mind back to 2019. This is the before times, you know, if any of you can remember that far back. A bright-eyed Shahar applies for a fellowship with the Australian Research Council, hence they are duly noted on the presentation. promising to study what was then seen to be the inexorable rise of quite intense competition between China and other providers of development financing. And the fellowship application went in, time had passed, the pandemic happened, and then in August 2020, I actually learned that I was successful. Of course, I was incredibly happy, but at that point, I couldn't really do the project. So I just suspended it for quite a while. Then I came back last year with the intention of actually resuming where I stopped previously. And then to my, well, surprise and potential dismay, you know, given the context, I was actually funded to do something, I realized that there wasn't actually that much competition happening at all. So, well, this paper is what scientists would call a no-finding paper, because I was aiming to learn what was happening around competition, especially in relation to infrastructure, and found that there wasn't any competition. So I'll try and explain to you why I think this competition has not materialized. Okay? So I'll just note, by the way, that this work is, like most of my work, co-authored with Lee Jones, and it is currently under review, and we'll see, hopefully it will get accepted, and then you'll be able to actually read the paper before too long. So, sorry, I'm just going to use this to change the slide. Just a little bit of kind of throat clearing here. I think we all know that China became a massive provider of development financing, often in the form of sovereign lending or sovereign-like lending. We know this because A-Data has done amazing work to uncover a lot of that kind of stuff. So I've just provided a couple of slides for just to give you a bit of a sense. So between 2013 and 2017, after the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, you can see that China's development financing dwarfs that of any other country, and that most of it is provided as, although the Chinese don't actually use those kinds of categories, as what is known as other official financing, meaning not development aid. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is that a lot of that financing has been delivered in the form of various forms of infrastructure and construction, and sometimes in the form of energy projects that are also kind of energy infrastructure. As a result of this enormous amount of lending, China became essentially the world's biggest creditor, and is now actually dwarfing the World Bank in terms of the amount of debt that is owed to it by other countries. So that's just kind of by way of context. So the reason why I wanted to study the competition was because it seemed like there was a lot of it going on. And the reason why it seemed like there was a lot of it going on was because there was a lot of talk, a lot of announcements being made about competition with China on infrastructure, which is where a lot of the financing was going. So this is the latest meeting of the Group of 7 industrialized nations. It actually happened here in Germany, maybe even here in Berlin. I'm not sure exactly where it happened, but these are the leaders of the G7. And here, that's a table that I pulled out of our draft, which actually documents all of the different initiatives that have been announced to compete with China on infrastructure in recent years by countries that are what you may call traditional donors. And we use that term to refer to countries that are members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, okay? The exception, and I'm sure you hear all about it when Professor Katada is here, is Japan, because Japan has always delivered a lot of infrastructure and has continued to do so, but it focuses all of its infrastructure financing on Southeast Asia. So Japan is an exception. Let's just kind of ignore Japan. But if you look at all the other initiatives, there are quite a lot of different announcements, and the ones that probably got the most headlines were actually from the Group of 7, and here talking about the famous or infamous, depending on who you talk to, Build Back a Better World B3W initiative that was announced in 2021 at the leaders meeting, and then there was a reboot of that announcement in the latest meeting that is in the picture there, known as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. In the paper, we focus on the United States, given that the United States is the biggest player in that group, and given that most of the announcements came from the United States. But the United States is not unique. Actually, the European Union has also made similar sort of announcements as well, and we can talk about those as well. But I think that fundamentally the story that we're telling the United States is not all that different from the story that you would get if you looked at these other players, like I said, except in Japan. So we have on the one hand a lot of these announcements being made and very publicly. I mean, you don't get a bigger platform than something like the G7 leaders meeting, right? Big announcements. We are going to be competing with China on infrastructure. We're going to be competing by providing quality infrastructure, high standards, but we're going to be doing this on scale. Some of the sums that have been thrown around are really quite significant. Here, for instance, in the latest PGII, so to speak, we're talking about a promise of around $600 billion. Previously, with the B3W, they didn't say an amount, but they said hundreds of billions, okay? Sorry, it's okay. Come on. Here you go. Oh, no? Doesn't work? Seems to have lost its mojo. I'm sorry. No, it's all right. Okay. Oh, sorry. Like that. Okay. You get to look at that image for a bit longer. I hope you appreciate it. Try again. Aha, here we go. The problem is that behind the big announcements, the results have been, to say paltry, I think is underselling it. I mean, they were below paltry, okay? So after the announcement of B3W, there is only around $6 million in financing awarded in the first year. By way of comparison, after the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, Chinese development financing went from around $60 billion to $90 billion. So there's a jump of $30 billion in that 1 year, okay? Here we're talking about $6 million in that first year. So basically nothing really in the world of, I mean, I would be quite happy to get $6 million, but in the world of development financing, we're talking about a fairly substantial amount. Then there's the Development Finance Corporation that was created even under the Trump administration. That was supposed to be, again, the United States vehicle for competing with China development financing. We've done a little bit of a look at the numbers in the paper. I'm not going to bore you with the details. They're not doing much. Firstly, the amounts that they have to play with are quite insignificant by the standards of what China spends on development financing. And also, they've spent a lot of that money not actually on infrastructure. A lot of it went to microfinance and those kinds of things. The amount that went to infrastructure is quite small. Okay, so just take my word for it because I haven't got the images there in front of you. Thing is, if you think about this from an IR perspective, the United States' failure to compete with China on infrastructure doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, because generally speaking, state-centric approaches, if you want to call them that, would assume that if a leadership of a country as powerful as the United States committed the United States to compete with China on infrastructure, which seems like a really important thing to do from the United States point of view, because the United States was facing, it's not actually fighting an actual war with China, so the forms of competition it's facing, infrastructure financing was one of the main challenges that they're facing there, right? So this is quite puzzling. I mean, how come you'd expect the United States to be able to mobilize a sizable amount of money to compete with China on infrastructure, given that is the main arena for competition today? So that is the kind of puzzle that drove us to write this paper, and again, having realized that there wasn't much competition going on. So the answer to this puzzle, we argue, and I hope you agree, it lies in basically the very different political economies that underpin and shape the operations of these two different states, the Chinese and the United States states, writ large. So our approach here, which is quite similar to the book, it's based in what you may call Gramscian state theory, and what we're trying to explain, or better explain, are the material limits on quote-unquote statecraft that arise from the interests of dominant social forces in both countries, and that are basically grounded in specific, context-specific dynamics of capitalist development in both countries. So just to kind of give you a little bit of introduction to this, I'm not going to talk a lot about theory here, but from our perspective, states are not neutral instruments that leaders can just repurpose and change and make them do what they want. We don't think that's how states work. We think that states are expressions of social power and interests, and we think that past and current struggles are shaping institutions in ways that what Jessup called strategically selected. And what that means is they're always, in every case, open to and better at promoting certain interests and certain agendas of some social forces more than others. So the argument that we're putting in a paper and that I'll be developing here is that states' ability to compete economically, which is what we're focusing on, but I think you can extend that to other arenas as well, depends basically on whether and how far state managers can mobilize the required productive forces and capital. And that in turn, we don't think that that is just, again, a matter of just free will. They can just decide to do that. That depends on whether their agenda corresponds to the interest of the group commanding those productive forces and capital. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a summary of the specific argument that we make in relation to China and the United States, and then I'm going to develop those in turn. So get a bit more into China, a bit more into the United States. So the point we make about China is that for China, the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially, to use David Harvey's term, a spatio-temporal fix for massive, massive industrial overcapacity and also the overaccumulation of capital within China's state-owned financial system. Now, those problems are not new, and they've threatened to undermine China's growth model for quite a long time, and I think everyone can now agree that China's growth model is in real trouble. So these things are kind of reaching the end of the line, perhaps. But because of that, they're also quite significant for dominant social forces' survival, and that produced a very powerful force for internationalization for China, especially through overseas infrastructure projects, and that's what we've seen with the Belt and Road Initiative. But these interests also shape the implementation of the Belt and Road, and that generates blowback that has limited the initiative and in a sense has brought it down to its knees now. Conversely, on the United States side, which I'll try and spend more time on actually, because I think that's the puzzle of the paper, we've had decades of deindustrialization and significant defunding of public infrastructure. And that means that there are now quite limited, or very few productive forces that the United States government can actually mobilize. Now, to develop infrastructure, the United States state, writ large, whether federal or at lower levels of government, has depended heavily on private capital, especially private financial capital. But the problem is, and that is in a sense the same problem that we get in the international financing domain, this capital only wants to be deployed in limited areas where profit can be pretty much guaranteed. Now, this model has failed abysmally domestically, but that is the model that the United States is trying to internationalize, and unsurprisingly, it hasn't succeeded very well with that, because the conditions for internationalizing financial capital are actually more complicated than even deploying it domestically within the United States. Hence, we don't see, as long as the United States attempts to work in this way to finance infrastructure in the global south, it will not succeed. I'm pretty much willing to put my name to that. It's recorded, so it's going to be on the record. Right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about China, which I think is probably something that many people here are more familiar with, and then I'll go and talk about the United States a bit more. So, as I mentioned before, we're doing a comparative political economy study here. So China's global infrastructure financing role, its absolute dominance in this area, we first need to situate that in the context of China's own capitalist development. So the basic model, since the end of the Maoist period, has been one where essentially, firstly, China sort of came out of that period with relatively good infrastructure in the context of developing countries, and also combined with the repression of labor and with the repression of household incomes, the way in which they're funneled into the state financial system, that's allowed China to attract enormous investments from advanced capitalist states as businesses there try to restore profitability by offshoring production to places with lower cost of labor after the 1970s. So export revenues from this process were then basically funneled into the state-owned banks to finance further upgrading of infrastructure and therefore supporting more export-led industrialization that essentially maintained the process. So it was kind of a cycle where you export the surplus, a lot of that is then funneled through the state banking system to build more infrastructure and so on. This obviously favored large-scale state-owned enterprises and to some extent private enterprise that emerged from within the CCP. And as we actually argue in the book, this is something we talk about quite a bit there, it consolidated the grip of a dominant but actually very fractious kind of capitalist class, which we think is, in a sense, the dominant social force within the Chinese party state, albeit very fractious, very divided. Crucially, as we know, development was no longer centrally planned. So from Deng Xiaoping onwards, subnational and especially provincial governments acquired wide policy latitude and engaged essentially in competitive investments to meet rapid central growth targets. Now this, as we know, produced basically unprecedented economic growth for China. You know, there's no country that has grown as fast. But also it has generated vast overexpansion in productive forces and infrastructural development relative to China's overall economy. And I've got a little bit of a blurb for you there. Again, that's from the paper that shows you the expansion from 1990 to the 2010s in some kind of basic figures. I mean, highway is just staggering, okay? But it's not just that. I mean, China, for those of you who have had a look, now basically produces more than half the world's steel, more than half the world's cement, and we're talking about rates that are about 10 times bigger than India, second place in steel, and about 6.5 times bigger than second place India in cement. It also has 2/3 of the world's high-speed railways and generates the most hydroelectricity of any country, and again outpacing the second place Brazil here threefold. So we're talking about vast expansion of infrastructure and capacity. But the result of this enormous capital investment has been overcapacity, which has been getting worse. So long before COVID-19, industrial overcapacity was reaching around 25%, but even skilled labor is overproduced in China. So for instance, we had a look, and China produces something like 22% of the world's civil engineers or something like that, and a very high rate of the world's science graduates. But it also cannot find employment for a lot of these graduates as well in those fields. So for China, the global financial crisis was the moment where these problems came to a bit of a head, and that, in a sense, is the beginning of the process that brought us to the Belt and Road Initiative. So, given the crisis that was then affecting the West, demand for the exports from China plummeted, at least for a time. So China could no longer really rely on that kind of cycle that I was mentioning before of export, investment in infrastructure, and so on. So these, the slowing of exports compounded industrial overcapacity in China, and that further squeezed profitability, which again has already been declining for quite some time, and basically brought us to a point, and you know, around the time the Belt and Road was initiated, you needed something like 5 yuan of investment to generate 1 yuan growth. Now it's, as I understand, something like 8 to 1. Okay, so it's basically an unsustainable situation in that respect. So more and more investment, more and more debt to generate less and less growth. And of course, you know, this problem was a massive problem for the banking system, which accumulated vast amounts of capital due to forced savings and exports as well. And also, of course, the foreign reserves that the Chinese, well, SAFE holds on behalf of the Chinese party state, which were also enormous at that point. So how they responded to that crisis, the Chinese policymakers, is a reflection of what we call the strategic selectivity of the Chinese party state. And that is the systematic preference of the interests of state and state-linked capital at the expense of workers and households. For years now, we've heard it many times, that China needs to shift into more of a consumption focus for its economy. But it just doesn't happen. Every time growth is slowing down, we get another push of investment, and it feeds into the same process. So as we argue actually in our Chatham House paper in particular, the Belt and Road Initiative was intended as a spatial temporal fix for these problems. So the idea was basically, instead of putting more and more of that investment domestically within China, let's push it out into the world and hopefully we can address this problem. Now the Belt and Road, like we said, has succeeded in a way because we've seen massive expansion of Chinese lending and investment, albeit not necessarily in countries that are supposedly part of the Belt and Road. But it has succeeded to the extent that basically it jibes with the powerful interests that, in a sense, the whole thing was organized around. So we have seen that, and they were obviously always intended to be the prime beneficiaries, that state-owned enterprises secured something like 96% of construction contracts and about 72% of all investments in the Belt and Road's first 5 years. And the Belt and Road also works because it suits Chinese financial sector's interests, and they're also heavily skewed towards supporting large-scale SOE projects, including, as we've seen, high-risk projects that traditional development finances would not fund. I'm not going to explain currently why, but there are a number of different reasons why they're the kinds of projects that the Chinese financial system likes to fund. Nonetheless, notwithstanding this kind of drive to internationalize, which has been very powerful, Chinese state-owned enterprises and banks, unlike what a lot of people within the kind of strategic studies in IR think, they're actually fairly independent day-to-day, and also they're profit-seeking actors. And that has conditioned how the Belt and Road projects were selected and how they were developed. They basically have attempted to use the Belt and Road Initiative as a way to maximize their profits and minimize their risk. Now, with respect to infrastructure financing and construction, there are basically two kinds of risks. There are pre-completion risks and then there are post-completion risks. And they try to minimize both. I'll just give you a little bit of a rundown here. Pre-completion risks include things like the cost and difficulties associated with feasibility studies, exploration, land acquisition, environmental and social impact assessment, and mitigation, and also other regulatory requirements, whatever they may be. Things like preparing and facilitating construction, the construction of the project itself, site security, which cannot be taken for granted, as we know, and financial risk like currency fluctuations, which is also a concern, especially given that most of these projects are lent in dollars. Post-completion risks, which are also very important, include things like political risk, so that's instability that it's endangering a project, nationalization of a project, policy or regulatory change, and also uncertain returns, which is obviously a big concern, especially if you're an investor. So, Chinese state-owned enterprises, naturally, because they are trying to get the most out of every situation, to bolster their bottom line, they bargain hard to shift those risks onto the Belt and Road recipient states while maximizing their own profits. And they often succeed for reasons that are to do more with the circumstances of those recipient countries, which are often very keen to receive investment and or financing, and they're often really keen to receive that for China, again for reasons I'm not going to get into right now. So consequently, we've seen a lot of these countries agree to fairly lopsided projects, where often the Chinese state-owned enterprises have actually pushed onto recipient state things like, mostly the pre-completion risk in this case, either directly or by incorporating local firms as partners in projects, and I've seen lots of that in my own research. Now, to minimize post-completion risks, which are also very significant, Chinese state-owned enterprises tend to prefer what they call turnkey projects, where they basically just pay to deliver the project and then they walk away. In those situations, they really have no real care in the world. I mean, they're quite happy to deliver the project, and then it doesn't matter to them whether the project is going to be good, bad, indifferent, viable, or not viable. And that's happened quite a bit. Less ideal for state-owned enterprises are basically build, operate, transfer projects, which are kind of shading into the world of investment. With China, it's always quite hard to see what's financing, what's investment. And in those cases, state-owned enterprise tends to kind of own and operate an infrastructure project for a fixed period. And it needs to make a return on whatever it is in that period, and then it turns it over to the recipient state or someone in those host countries. Now, of course, this tends to be feasible only for projects that generate direct user fees. But we have seen Chinese state-owned enterprises bargain very hard to minimize the post-completion risks in those projects by, for instance, insisting that host states provide guaranteed income streams or underpin, a set kind of basic level of return on. I've seen that certainly with dams, for instance. So even if the dam's not generating electricity, they get a minimal sort of fee that can secure their bottom line. course, the riskiest model for them is equity investment, and that means taking responsibility for some for the long term, and they tend to try and avoid that. But when they do agree to those kinds of agreements, they tend to go for longer term contracts that maximize profit generation window, or at the very least secure tradable outputs that they can then profit from. Similarly, so this is the state and enterprises side, but on the banking side and the insurance side, they also strike very hard bargains, a lot more than people often give them credit for. So Chinese banks, for instance, would use quite controversial methods in order to collateralize their loans, like, for instance, mortgaging future oil sales, something that has been pointed out quite a bit. But again, that's also to kind of protect their returns, their financing. So basically, if we look at this context that I just described to you, you can see that the initiation and character of the Belt and Road Initiative was very closely determined by the powerful forces that exist within China's party state, within the political economy. And basically, the attempt via the Belt and Road Initiative was to internationalize China's own development model in order to address the shortcomings of that development model that had emerged domestically before. But because that is essentially what that model, what the Belt and Road is attempting to do, we see some of the very same problems that emerge domestically then emerge internationally in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, the state-owned enterprises and the banks often are basically looking after their own interests, sometimes in ways that create significant headaches for the recipient countries. And because of the way that they engage, well, firstly, they often did not engage at all where they couldn't make profits. Other times that finance or build things that recipient countries don't really need, creating debt problems. And you know, the statistics on the returns from Belt and Road Initiative projects are not very good. So controversies also began to mount over things like environmental damage, labor abuses, community displacement, white elephant projects, and so on, unsustainable debt. So that has dampened, I mean, obviously there are a lot of useful projects as well, but that's a kind of story that started to circulate around a lot of Chinese financing. So that has dampened the reputation of a lot of recipient countries for Chinese debt, and has also damaged, arguably, China's global reputation in this area. And you can see that essentially this is even before the COVID-19 crisis, China's development financing rates plummeted. They reached a peak in 2016 and basically fell after that. So essentially, as resistance began to mount to China's Belt and Road Initiative from a lot of recipient countries and beyond that, policy began to shift within China as well. So in 2017, in reaction to this blowback, Chinese regulators and banks tightened their rules and suppressed things like entertainment and real estate investments, which basically were no more than capital flight, and that was quite a significant part of lending up to that point. We also began to see things like personnel from the Commission for Discipline Inspection basically join projects or go into the field to try and see what is happening with these projects. And then Xi Jinping, of course, in 2019 in the Belt and Road Forum, never acknowledging everything, but began to kind of implicitly acknowledge that there were problems with the Belt and Road Initiative, talked about how China needs to move to a clean and green Belt and Road, and promise high quality projects. Now, this combined with the increasing hesitancy of recipients essentially brought us here, you know, where essentially there's not much Chinese lending happening at all. But that's not the end of the story. I mean, we have seen Chinese policymakers beginning to experiment, and also, of course, state and enterprise begin to experiment with other forms of financing. Some of them are not entirely new, but they're becoming more significant. So, for instance, special purpose vehicle funds, trying to involve more private finance as well, very much like the West in this case, to try and reduce policy banks' risk and dependence on sovereign debt. And what may happen, and I think that's a reasonable kind of prediction, if I can do that from this vantage point, is that we might see China's involvement with global infrastructure financing shift towards these these forms of financing from the sovereign lending, sovereign-like lending that we've heard about quite a lot. And of course, China is also emphasizing non-infrastructure forms of development assistance, and the Global Development Initiative is the new buzzword from Beijing, although it's very hard to know exactly what that means, but what we've heard about that makes it sound a lot like the kind of things that the West is doing with development, with its aid program, things like capacity building and sustainability and so on. So what it looks like here, this is Chinese investment. You can see that even though it also fell after 2016, 2017, you can see that it remains at fairly substantial levels now. And you can see that the same sort of sectors remain significant, and maybe that will be, if you like, the new model, but at the lower levels. Well, we're still talking about, according to the American Enterprise Institute, which, there are problems with their database, don't get me wrong, but that's indicative. We can see that we're still talking about fairly high levels of investment, even after all these problems. Right, so that's China. Let's look at the United States in the time that we have. So we talked a lot about the problems of Chinese development financing so far, but these problems pale into insignificance if you look at the kinds of issues that have affected the United States. Now, the United States basically cannot mobilize the same kinds of productive forces or capital, and that is due to its very, very different political economy. From the 1970s onwards, in the so-called neoliberal era, we see perennial underinvestment in infrastructure in the United States and industrial hollowing out of the United States. And those, and I'll show you some figures in a moment, have eroded relevant productive forces in the United States, and that they generate basically no impetus from industry to internationalize in the same way that China does. Also, the United States, mainly now, the United States state that is, primarily serves the interests of finance capital, and it depends on finance capital, albeit unsuccessfully, for financing infrastructure within the United States. So what the United States has done to compete with China was to basically scale up what is an ineffective domestic approach to building infrastructure to the international level. And what they're trying to do is to use the jargon to escort finance capital into developing country infrastructure projects. But private investors are not really interested in such high-risk, long-term investments, and that results in very disappointing outcomes for them. So, of course, it was not always the case, we know that. The United States' heyday was in the New Deal era, which was from the 1930s to the 1960s. And in that time, we actually saw very substantial, sustained industrial growth in the United States and very significant infrastructural development as part of what was basically an attempt to stabilize American capitalism in the context of both domestic and international strife. So in the 1930s, an era of depression, actually, in terms of infrastructure, it was a very good time. So investment in street and highway development in the United States increased by 2/3 at that time. So a lot of the roads that even now exist in the United States were built then. After World War II, the main driver of infrastructure development in the United States was suburbanization. Although we saw mainly private developers build the actual suburbs, we still saw American governments at all levels, increasingly also the federal government, get involved in building all the public infrastructure around that. And we're talking about very significant expansion in those decades. But from the 1970s, the United States state, and I'm using this to include at all the levels, and I'll talk more in detail about the different levels in a second, was increasingly reconfigured around the interests of finance capital, resulting in what I said before was industrial hollowing out and infrastructural decline. Now, why that happened, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, reflected the particular response of American government elites, both in business and in government, to the 1970s multifaceted crisis of capitalism, the so-called stagflation crisis. So part of that was, the industrial offshoring that kind of kicked off the very rapid economic growth that we talked about before in the Chinese context, but also in other countries in East Asia. But that transformation of the American state also meant that infrastructure investment, or investment in general, public investment and public goods declined dramatically. And the figures are really quite staggering. So from the early 1980s, we see federal infrastructure financing halving basically from 1% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP. That's very substantial. And we know that that does not, it doesn't reflect declining fiscal capacity, because we also know that American public debt blew up spectacularly over the same period. So the capacity to raise debt was not the issue. They could have raised money and invest in infrastructure, but they just decided not to do so. In the United States, most of the funding for new infrastructure and maintenance falls to lower levels of government, the states and sometimes cities and others. So their fiscal capacity has been in decline for quite some time, and they've relied on federal top-ups to actually improve infrastructure. But with federal financing for infrastructure declining, it all basically fell to them, and they just don't have the capacity. States in the United States cannot run deficits in the same way that the federal government can. So basically, if their fiscal capacity is affected by, for instance, the global financial crisis or something like that, they just need to cut. They just don't have the capacity to go to borrow money or to even quote-unquote print money in the way that the federal government of the United States can. They can raise debt through bonds for infrastructure. They can do that. But the repayments on these bonds are considered to be part of their operational costs. So they would, again, if they raised a lot of money and they have a lot of interest repayments and those kinds of things, they would still need to cut somewhere. They just don't have the capacity to raise vast amounts of money for infrastructure. And they've been quite reluctant to do that. We know that they have, because we can see that the percentage of GDP attributed to states spent on infrastructure has remained constant since the 1970s. So they basically don't want to take on more debt. Now, if governments are not going to do it, it all basically ended up falling to the private sector and to finance specifically to finance infrastructure in the United States. And successive US governments, going back quite a while now, have basically tried to get private investment into infrastructure through public-private partnerships. That's been the model for quite a long time. And this is very, very similar to what's happening in the international domain. It's like basically the principle, you take a little bit of public money and you use that to encourage a lot of private money to do what public money doesn't want to do. But the results have been, again, to sound overwhelming is probably an understatement. They've been very poor. Because mobilizing private finance into infrastructure development is very, very difficult. And it shouldn't really surprise us. I don't know if anyone here has read the recent book by Decon, Gambling on Development. And basically what is argued there is that, you know, when governments build infrastructure, they're quote-unquote gambling on development. They don't actually expect it to generate immediate returns that they can repay straight away. They expect that it will generate economic growth that over time would increase their capacity, and then they could repay the cost of that infrastructure. And sometimes they will do it just because they think it's a public good and they'll do it anyway. Whether it pays back at any point or not, they'll just do it. But that is not at all how private finance works. Private investors are profit-seeking. Their calculus is a very different calculus. What they want is reliable returns. And they will invest when they can, well, reasonably expect a reliable and safe return on an investment. And of course, this is in the context of you know, the doctrine of maximizing shareholder value, which has made a lot of companies, including financial companies, very short-termist. So they want gains, and they want them now. You know, they want something to start paying very quickly. So profit-seeking, risk aversion, and short-termism are not compatible with what it takes to build infrastructure on scale. Now, of course, you know, governments have been, in a way, aware of this, right? And they've attempted in different ways to try and minimize the risk for investors in order to still get them to invest. And they're basically two different kinds of strategies, and some people like Daniela Gabor have written about this quite a bit. So it's basically an attempt to de-risk the investment for private finance. And there are whole different ways to do that. I'm not going to get into them in any detail here. But essentially, the aim is to create some kind of a public backstop to ensure that the risk to private investors is not significant, and in case of things going wrong, they will be either bailed out or they'll have a capacity to recoup their investment without having to make a loss. And the United States government at different levels has done a lot to try and encourage PPPs. Again, I'm not going to bore you with the detail, just take my word for it. But they've not been very successful. So despite all that they've done, from 1985 to 2016, there are just around 500 PPPs across the entire United States, and they totaled a combined $116 billion. This is in a context where the infrastructure gap is in the trillions, okay? It's not doing anything like enough. This might shock you, but the result of governments not investing and the private sector not investing as well have led to a significant decline in the quality of infrastructure in the United States. And that's well documented. There is a group called the American Society of Civil Engineers, and every year, I encourage you to do that, it's riveting read. They produce a report that details the quality of infrastructure across the United States, and they give it a mark, okay? They mark it like a school paper, you know? So currently they grade US infrastructure at C-, which is actually a little bit better than it was at one point. But they argue that you need around $3 trillion over the next 10 years just to get to B, okay? Now no one's spending $3 trillion over the next 10 years. So on the one hand, you've got US population growing by around 50% since the late 1970s. And you've got US GDP growing by 713% since the late 1970s. But that's what it looks like in terms of industrial output in some of the relevant industries for infrastructure construction. And it's not entirely surprising because there is no pipeline for projects, so there's just not a lot of investment going on. So you can see that the United States at one point was the major player in some of these industries, but not anymore. And in some sectors, the decline has been quite dramatic. So because industrial capacity is not actually that significant, certainly not compared to what's happening in China, there isn't the same impetus to internationalize. There's just not that excess capacity just sitting there wanting to be internationalized in the same way as in China. There is no steel baron sitting in the United States going, come on, we need this. They don't have the same excess capacity. So the United States essentially lacks the productive forces to support competition with China on infrastructure development, but it also, and this is perhaps going to be more surprising, maybe not if you've kind of been going with me so far, it also lacks the capital. I mean, China's had all that capital that was directed towards infrastructure financing. The United States has lots of capital, but not capital that wants to invest in infrastructure projects. So the United States-led initiatives basically are attempting to scale up to the global level an approach that has manifestly failed domestically within the United States to build infrastructure. And that is the approach of trying to get private capital to do it. Now this might seem irrational to you, and it is irrational, but it reflects, as I've been arguing here, essentially the strategic selectivity of the US state. The US state works for capital, works for finance, and it is putting finance in the center of these programs. The problem though is the finance doesn't want to do it. So even though the whole thing is organized around financial sector's interests, finance doesn't actually want to be funding these projects. So nothing happens. So the agenda that the United States is trying to implement here internationally, as I said, is built on the domestic context there, but also it is not a new agenda in international development either. It basically is a reheating of what has been known as the billions to trillions agenda, which the World Bank especially the International Finance Corporation, has been promoting for quite some time. In 2015, a bunch of multilateral development banks published the billions to trillions paper, the document, and I've got some choice quotes for you there from that document, and you can see how the logic is very similar to the logic that I was just describing within the United States. So essentially the document says that private finance, and I'm sorry for the small font there, but I'll kind of just regale you with some kind of key quotes here. Private finance is not programmable by or responsive to policy-making bodies, right? That's what we hear. It is motivated by risk-reward considerations. And so a paradigm shift is required to, and I'm quoting all this, unlock, leverage and catalyze private flows. Public bodies therefore need to either decrease perceived risk or increase anticipated returns, so the private business can deliver profit. Okay? Consequently, the role of multilateral development banks and the IMF needs to shift to encouraging developing countries to create a quote, supportive business environments, including measures to promote wider participation in domestic capital markets. For example, and again I'm quoting here, innovative debt financing structures such as securitization and portfolio risk sharing. And also, multilateral development banks need to become brokers between commercial interests and policymakers working to structure commercially viable projects by arranging the necessary incentives to address risk-return requirements of the private sector. Multilateral development banks should, again I'm quoting, build up a pipeline of bankable investment-ready projects with terms appealing to investors and financiers and arrangements that quote-unquote mitigate risks such as public-private partnerships, and again I'm quoting, with relevant guarantees, risk insurance and innovative financing aimed at reducing individual investor costs for project preparation and execution. So that's what the document there says, and that's all the major multilateral development banks in the world at that point. So in short, and this is not a new agenda, development financing has been reconfigured around basically quote-unquote escorting private capital into developing countries by mitigating the pre- and post-completion risk that I mentioned before. That's basically what this is about. So the various, and again I'm excluding Japan from this, I'm sure that Professor Katara will tell you how it's very, very different. And it's actually quite interesting. Why? Because it's more like China in this context. The various initiatives that have been announced to compete with China's development financing essentially are a reheated version of this. Okay? So for instance, when they announced the B3W in 2021, and again I'm quoting here, the aim is to address the 40+ trillion infrastructure needed in the developing world. The G7 will, again I'm quoting, coordinate in mobilizing private sector capital with investments from our respective development finance institutions, catalyzing hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure investment for low and middle income countries. And with the more recent PG, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Initiative, likewise, again, I'm quoting, it will be based on leveraging private sector investments with claims in that same announcements that millions of dollars in public money can mobilize tens or hundreds of millions or billions in further private investment, or tens or hundreds of millions can mobilize billions. So essentially all of these schemes assume that you can use a little bit of public money to mobilize a lot of private money. That is the underlying assumption in all of these different initiatives in the global south, for that reason, for that matter. Now there are other ways they could have done that. You know, they could have raised money through fiscal means. They could have taxed the financial system. This is not the only way you can do it, arguably, but that is how they've decided to do that. And that indicates, you know, given what we know about the strategic selectivity of these states, that they are devoted to facilitating profit making by financial interests, and that in a sense leaves infrastructure development, whether at home or abroad, hostage to these interests. Now where did this come from? You know, it's the idea that there is a glut of savings that financial institutions hold. Where do they get those savings? Well, essentially we're talking about years of QE, all sorts of processes that have basically savings, of course, of workers through pension schemes and so on, that have put enormous amounts of money in the hands of private sector actors. So the idea is to make investments in poor countries or developing countries a new asset class for these investors, so they can derive new returns from them. That is essentially the aim here. But this approach, as we've seen, has failed to develop infrastructure in the United States and in many other Western countries. I know that in Europe they've done plenty of this as well, and usually not very successfully. And we also know that billions to trillions has been tried for quite some time, so there's a bit of data on what happened there. So we know that it doesn't actually work. It doesn't work in mobilizing the kinds of money that supposedly it's meant to mobilize. So after billions to trillions was announced in 2015, the kinds of private financing that international financial institutions have mobilized actually declined, okay? It actually almost halved, actually more than halved, in the time after the announcement was made. So not only did it not mobilize finance, it actually mobilized less finance after the announcement was made than before the announcement was made. And you might ask yourself, why that is, and that's to do with basically the cycle of tightening associated with so-called taper tantrum. So quantitative easing was wound up in the United States, there was less money, so there was less money for this as well. From 2015 to 2019, the G7 countries actually provided around $100 billion in ODA, so like in aid, for infrastructure in developing economies, but private investment in that time was only around $22 billion. And this is in a context where the OECD estimates that you need something like $6.5 trillion in order to address the infrastructure needs of developing countries. Now, clever people have basically estimated how much public to private money, what is the ratio that you need in order to do the work, and came up with something like 1 to 4 to 1 to 6. So 1 public dollar for 4 to 6 private dollars. In reality, the rate mobilized so far has been 1 to 0.7. Okay, so it's not even 1 for 1. Institutional investors, pension funds and the like, which are meant to be the kind of the biggest, the one that are really going to be involved and have a lot of money and all the rest of it, they've been really disinterested because they really want very safe investment. So they've only provided so far this is the kind of figures that make you laugh, 0.67% of all private participation by 2018. Okay, so they basically have no interest in this. Okay. So as I mentioned, the reason why private investment has declined despite these announcements of the multilateral development banks has nothing to do with their announcement. It has a lot to do with what's happening in the financial system at that time, with it's in a kind of monetary expansive mode or more contractory mode. And I guess the basic point here is that try all you like, you cannot actually risk, quote unquote, investment in global south development to the extent that would actually mobilize sufficient amounts of capital. Because the same kinds of risks that prevent a lot of private investment from going into infrastructure in developed countries are magnified in a lot of developing countries. So they're even less likely to do that there than they would be in the rich countries. And when they do invest, and again, this is exactly the same thing that we've seen in infrastructure private investments, in places like Germany or the United States, they tend to invest in middle-income countries, not in the poorest countries, because they generally are perceived to have a better capacity to repay. And also they tend to invest in sectors where they can legitimately expect returns, safer returns. So for instance, where private financing has gone are things like, and this is, I'm talking about those more recent announcements, this is like the long-term billions to trillions agenda. So there's, like I said, a bit of data on this. So they've been invested mostly in things like energy, because you can derive returns on energy projects. And things like information and communication technologies, things like mobile phones where they can get user fees and things like that. But they've not really invested hardly at all in things like water, sanitation and so on that actually are much more badly needed. And again, the United States Development Financing Corporation has been working for a few years, and we can see in its own figures that essentially the same thing happened there. So the irony here is that rather than competing with China, what we see is different development financing competitions competing with each other over the relatively small number of investable, bankable projects the private financiers want to get into. So they're not competing with China, they're competing with each other because the number and availability of these projects is very low. And that's sort of been the story there. So I'm going to wrap up very shortly. Sorry, I forgot all these slides. My apologies. So there are a few implications of this for, I guess, where we're going forward. The first thing is that the reason why the United States and its allies are competing with China on infrastructure is because they think that they should. Okay, because China is building infrastructure and they see it as something that they need to do as well, or they're going to risk, losing support in the global south. They're going to lose markets. They're going to, all those kinds of concerns loom large. But clearly, they're blundered into a form of competition that they can't win. They definitely can't win under the existing model. Now, what do you do from here? Firstly, there's always the option of not competing at all, certainly not on mega projects, and I think that's probably quite a good option in this case. Certainly because the Belt and Road Initiative itself seems to have shriveled away anyway. So I think there's probably not as urgent a need to compete, even if you do take a more hawkish mindset to this and you think that the West should be competing with China. I think there is a good case to just not compete at all. But what we've been arguing for quite a while is that one thing that that Western governments and organizations can do and can do really well is actually help the governments, the elites and civil society actors and media in developing countries where China engages. They can help them in different ways to manage those relationships with China better. And I think that's an area where we could do a whole lot better. And that does not involve competing, it involves actually helping them get the best deal, whoever they're engaging with. And maybe that is something that I think we can do, and I think that would benefit them more. But now, and I finished my talk basically, I'm going to go back to the wreckage of my project and figure out what I'm going to do with it. Thank you.
Fantastic talk.